Before we completely leave the topic of checking and verifying, we need to spend time thinking about some of the specific informal fallacies of logic that people see cropping up again and again in historical study. I and other professors have been fighting against these diabolical forces for years, and sadly in the larger culture, the diabolical forces seem to be winning. While we could spend a whole term on nothing but this topic, today I'd like to call out and name some of the specific examples of poor reasoning that seem to just keep cropping up. While I doubt we can shift the whole tide of culture, hopefully we can at least arm you against some of the most common tactics the enemy uses to promote bad thinking. Every little bit helps, and as G.I. Joe will tell you, knowing is half the battle. So let's clear the air a bit. Why should we bother with this? Why not simply jump right back into the writing and the research? Well, the fact is that there has never been a greater need, probably in the history of this country or culture, for a return to strong critical thinking skills. I wasn't joking when I said that things have never been worse in my own lifetime. I've seen students in my classes and the talking heads on TV and the internet shift from simply being ignorant of basic logical thought to actively and intentionally embracing and employing fallacious thinking to accomplish their goals. You heard that right. People today are actually intentionally employing logical fallacies to push you into adopting their point of view and pursuing their political and social agendas. This is especially the case in historical study, where critical theory takes an intentionally subjectivist, assertive approach to try to force you into line by any means necessary. And if that means fooling you or beating you over the head with a logical fallacy, so be it. The only way to be prepared is to study and know what's coming. It doesn't help that traditionally historians have tended to think very concretely and unphilosophically. This has left a large number of historians unequipped to resist the cultural and philosophical changes that have come flowing down like a tsunami from all sides of the academic culture war. As discussed in our talks on modern historiography elsewhere, this has led some more recent historians to become passive in the face of the degradation of the profession, and others still to take up their mantles as outright and intentional propagandists in various political and social causes. As Christians, we have a higher obligation, and therefore we must find a deeper grounding if we want to succeed in our mission to create strong, truthful, and useful history that will hopefully last beyond our lifetimes. The good news in all this is that while the study of logic might fade away as a popular fad, logic itself never gets quote-unquote old. Logic is like math in that no matter how many years pass or how unhappy the answer may make people in a particular society, as long as this universe lasts, 2 plus 2 will always equal 4. So to study logic is to study something that is always useful, potent, and powerful. Most of the fallacies we'll be studying here come from Historians' Fallacies by David Hackett Fischer. It's been out there for decades, and copies are cheap and easy to find. If you're picking up what I'm laying down here and understand the importance, getting a copy of your own is an excellent idea. Our first fallacy is a famous one called circular reasoning or begging the question. It involves assuming the answer to a question before we've even fairly asked it, and then using our assumption to answer the question. An example of this might be if someone came to you and claimed that he or she saw a ghost, and you replied, "You can't have seen a ghost because ghosts don't exist." Well, the very fact that this person claims to have seen one calls into question whether ghosts are real or not. So I hope you see the problem. Another famous example of this kind of reasoning is to discuss a miracle like the historic resurrection of Christ with an atheist. By definition, an atheist believes that miracles are impossible because God does not exist. No God, no miracles. But if God doesn't exist, no amount of evidence for the resurrection could ever convince them that it occurred because they've already decided that no miracle could ever occur. And once again, the idea of a resurrection is one of the proofs that could show that a miracle occurred. So you have to step back and stop assuming the answer before you've even asked the question. The conclusion points back to the presumption, and the presumption is essentially the conclusion, so it's one big circle. And before Christians get snooty, have you ever heard someone argue that we know God exists because the Bible says so, and we know we can trust the Bible because God wrote it? Yep, that's circular reasoning too, and frankly, it's embarrassing. It's another reason why Christians should understand logic and use better arguments. But we see this expressed in historical scholarship all the time. Could the American founders have really meant they wanted all men to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Of course not, or so the circular argument goes, because we know that the U.S. was founded on racism from 1619 on. Of course, the very existence of something like the Declaration of Independence and its ideals calls the wholesale racist nation narrative into question. So you shouldn't simply assume it before you've actually looked at the evidence. The way to avoid this trap is to take a step back and ask yourself about all the assumptions and presumptions that are being thrown at you, or that you yourself are toying with. How do they all connect and why? It's important that each step be consistent with the next. The fallacy of equivocation happens when people start playing games with definitions, either by accident or on purpose. In particular, the speaker switches definitions in mid-discussion, and if you aren't paying careful attention, they can force you to accept an incorrect conclusion. An example of this happens often in discussions of evolution. A person asks, "Do you believe in evolution?" The other, thinking that the question pertains to what's called macroevolution, which is one kind of animal changing into a completely different kind of animal, replies, "No, I don't." The first person then pounces. "What? How do you think we got all these breeds of dogs and cows and cats? Don't you think that if a dog moves into a colder climate, it grows more hair? Haven't you seen Darwin's experiment with the finches?" The second person is caught off guard. She actually does believe that and knows that it's beyond doubt true. She's stuck. So what happened? The first person has changed the definition of evolution in the middle of the discussion. Dogs growing more or less hair isn't macroevolution. It's microevolution. They're two different things. Offering evidence for microevolution doesn't prove macroevolution. Dogs can grow hair as long as Rapunzel's braids, and they'll still be dogs. You would need to show a dog becoming a different kind of animal entirely in order to prove the point, like a dog becoming a cow or a frog or whatever. But because the switch went unnoticed, the first speaker, quote-unquote, won the argument. This happens in history and elsewhere regularly. Consider the changing definitions of the word liberty. People today accuse earlier Americans, especially Christians, of not respecting liberty. This would be shocking to those Americans who have gone before and fought and died specifically for liberty. The problem is that we have once again two definitions of liberty, at least. Earlier Americans said that liberty was the right to do all right or morally neutral things freely and without government interference. Illegal or immoral things you were not free to do, like commit adultery or murder or steal. By liberty, though, many modern Americans mean the right to do anything at all, including acts like adultery and in some cases even murder, with impunity. The key point here is to listen carefully for the words that are being used and make sure you understand their basic definitions and implications. If you see one changing, call it out and put a stop to it early in the process. You may have heard of something being called a red herring. It was a phrase that came from training hunting dogs in the old world. Trainers would drag dried fish around to try to distract the dogs from the real scent of their actual target. So the term came to be used for anything that is used in an attempt to divert attention away from the central argument or point. Normally, people do this because they realize that if the original line of argument is followed through to its conclusion, they won't like where it takes you. As a result, they try to distract you from going there by offering other, often unrelated evidence. Consider the question, paraphrase from Fischer, Someone asks you, is Senator Jones a crook? Well, let's say that you happen to like Senator Jones, and so you reply that Senator Jones is a nice, pleasant person who attends church and serves his community. He is faithful to his wife, loves his children, and uses his money to donate to charitable causes. Senator Jones is also being attacked by the insert name of your hated political party here, and serves on several important committees. On and on and on it goes with similar type statements. And all of that and more may be true, but it does not change the fact that Senator Jones is a very great crook who has been siphoning money from his constituents for years. In this example, we don't want to admit the uncomfortable truth about Senator Jones, and so we offer up a string of vaguely related but ultimately unconnected evidence that is supposed to distract our listeners from what we don't want them to hear, that he's a crook. The key here is to listen carefully and keep the original question in mind. Draw connections between that question and every piece of evidence offered in response. If those connections aren't there, call it out and demand that the original question be answered directly. The fallacy of argument ad baculum is enjoying a bit of a renaissance these days. This fallacy is the big stick fallacy, and it occurs when someone appeals to force to win an argument rather than going at it through logic. In a way, it's the ultimate example of anti-logic. We aren't giving you any specific reason to agree with us. We're basically threatening to hurt you physically, mentally, financially, emotionally, whatever it takes, until you agree. There are a number of obvious historical examples of this quote-unquote argument being employed. In Nazi Germany, you quickly learned to stay quiet about Hitler or you would get a visit from the Brown Shirts or the SS. On many college campuses today, and for years, certain ideas have been de facto banned or limited to designated free speech areas. If you express those ideas in a non-designated area, you will be subject to punishment, fine, and possible expulsion. Certain scientific ideas, like intelligent design, expressed professionally, are enough to get you fired. More recently, in the debate over the use of preferred pronouns, people can be fired or disciplined at work for refusing to use them. At this point in time, Scotland has even declared a refusal to use someone's pronouns illegal, and if you do it, you're subject to arrest, fines, and punishments. In the end, this is one of those fallacies that sadly has no effective response from a logical standpoint. Being based on force and not reason, there is no effective quote-unquote counter-argument. All you can do if you're exposed to it is recognize it and defend yourself by whatever means you have at your disposal. For Christians, especially in a radicalized and polarized academic and political environment, that means we must weigh our words carefully, be well educated on our legal rights to free speech, and willing to push back politely, honorably, and firmly when necessary. Another non-evidential fallacy is the fallacy of argument ad verecundium. This is the proverbial appeal to authority. It isn't just that the author consults and discusses the opinion of an expert or famous specialist. That's all well and good, and I encourage you to do it regularly. In fact, I encourage you to become the specialist, the expert, to be famous. The fallacy occurs when the author uses the opinion of an expert as a rhetorical bludgeon to try to force people into agreeing with them without using other outside supporting evidence. It's the difference between talking about the opinion of an expert in the context of other evidence and using the expert's opinion as the only evidence you have. You should believe this because this famous person says so. This fallacy is similar to another one we've already mentioned in a different talk, though not by name, called the fallacy of prevalent proof. Just because lots of people believe something, even if they are very smart people and very famous, it doesn't follow that the something they all believe is true. Once again, there was a time when every famous and smart person alive but one thought that the sun revolved around the earth. That did not make it so. What these fallacies both have in common is that they are largely emotional. They appeal to how the hearer feels and wants to feel. In effect, you're being told, this very smart person thinks this is true, and if you want to be thought smart too, you'll agree. Only idiots will disagree. The obvious implication is that if you dare say something different, then something is wrong with you and people will think you're a fool. Everyone wants to be well regarded and thought intelligent. I've never met someone who really enjoys the idea of being thought an idiot. So this exerts massive pressure on even the best minds to knuckle under. Once again, it has nothing to do with evidence or logic. This is raw manipulation. Never accept a premise you want to question just because so-and-so, or a lot of so-and-sos, happen to like it. The fallacy of ad hominem is another famous one, and one that students often learn about very early on. It's also known as the genetic fallacy because it attacks the person, not the argument. This is another one of those fallacies of distraction where you take the attention off of your weak evidence by focusing it onto something else. Here you attack the source of the argument, the arguer. Now, it should only take a moment's reflection to realize that the ultimate truth of a statement doesn't necessarily relate to the person who's doing the speaking. It relates to the outside external world. Is this true or not? For example, if I told you that words build bridges into unexplored regions, what would you think? That sounds probably true and may even be profound. You could see it on a motivational poster, right? Maybe it inspires you to go out and sub-create like Tolkien suggested and write your own novel. Well, what if I told you that it is allegedly a quote from Adolf Hitler? Would that change the essential truth conveyed about the power of those words? Does the fact that Hitler had the words come out of his mouth make them wrong? Of course not. That's a rather dramatic example, but it holds true across the board. Even liars and idiots can speak true and accurate words. Even blind hogs find some acorns sometimes, as the saying goes. But the fallacy tries to invalidate the argument by invalidating the speaker. This cannot be true because this person is a liar, or a fool, or unpopular, or what have you. I saw a recent social media post from a college in Virginia where Christian groups have been ostracized and heavily criticized unfairly by some of the more radical groups on campus. When one of the Christian groups pointed out the hypocrisy in this, one of the radical students responded that, "You don't get to say you've been discriminated against, ever. Christians will always be the oppressors." In doing so, this person basically invalidated the right of that Christian student to even speak publicly because of who she was. Nothing she ever said would ever be considered legitimate. That's the fallacy of ad hominem in a nutshell. At the same time, this can be an extremely effective emotion-based weapon in a postmodern society. Just think. If someone suddenly calls you a bad person in the middle of an argument, how do you respond? How do you want to respond? Most of us will stop and say, "Oh, no, I'm not." In doing so, you've let them take the focus off of the weakness in their own positions, and they have now put you on trial. In the right circumstances, from then on, nothing you have to say will have any value until you've proven your worth as a decent human being by their standards, something your opponent will never allow if you continue to disagree with them on any level. It's insidious, and the only real hope you have is to recognize it, call it out, and demand that people keep the focus on the argument. Next, we have two closely related fallacies, cum hoc propter hoc and post hoc propter hoc. Both are Latin, and they mean with this because of this, and after this because of this. People fall into them when they notice that two things seem to happen suspiciously close to each other, and then they assume that one must somehow be causing the other. With cum hoc, the two things are happening at the same time, and so are supposedly connected. And with post hoc, one thing happens first, and then is followed immediately by the other, so it seems to be cause and effect. On the surface, this might seem pretty logical. Isn't that the basic idea of cause and effect? Something happens and it causes something else. True, but the problem comes in connecting the events. It's a big, wide world with lots and lots of things going on in it, all at the same time. Fischer tells the story of a woman taking a cruise on a ship. Late one evening, she got out of bed and reached for the light in her cabin. Unbeknownst to her, her ship was about to crash into another ship crossing its lane. Right as she flipped the switch to turn on the light, the impact occurred and she was thrown to the floor. In tears, she rushed out the door, grabbed the first crew member she found, and apologized for flipping the ship's emergency brake. Yeah. Just because two things occur at the same time, or one right after the other then, it doesn't follow that they are necessarily connected. Sometimes people will use the correspondences to imply a relationship between the two events. For example, historian Edward Gibbon noticed that as Christianity grew more powerful, the Western Roman Empire weakened. He argued then that Christianity destroyed the empire. But did it? Later historians have since identified a myriad of other better causes, from corruption to immigration to invasion to financial decay, on which the blame should be fixed. If you already dislike Christianity for some reason, then you certainly would be drawn to the correspondence and want to emphasize it, as Gibbon did, though. As historians in particular, and thinkers in general, we have to keep in mind that to establish causation, we have to go farther than simply showing that two things occurred in time near each other. We have to do the hard work of actually connecting them together and explaining why they worked the way they did. And we should demand the same from others. The fallacy of moderation is another popular one, and once again it has to do with how it makes us feel about ourselves. It happens when we appeal to a moderate position on the assumption that the middle ground is always by definition true. You probably know this one by heart and have even used it on yourself. You look at two different positions and you say, well, the truth is always in the middle. But is it? A few moments' thought can usually turn up several examples where that's definitely not the case. To bring the Nazis back into it again, because they make things so very stark and clear morally that it's hard to argue with, what would have been the moderate opinion on the Jews in pre-war Germany? One side said that the Jews were human and should be treated like equal citizens. The other side said that they were human vermin and should be expelled and exterminated. Should the middle way then be to kill some, expel others, and leave a few alone? I hope your stomach turned over at that very suggestion. Of course, in this case, the answer is an extreme, quote-unquote. The Jews were humans and due human rights. To compromise that would be evil and barbaric. Thankfully, most of our choices aren't that extreme, but the principle is the same. There is no guarantee that the middle will always be right. This fallacy, as we said, is yet another appeal to emotion. Psychologically, humans dislike the feeling that they are outliers. They want to feel like they're moderate, and this is true whether or not you're a liberal or a conservative, left-leaning or right-leaning. No matter where a person's specific beliefs fall on the spectrum, if you ask them, they will generally tell you that they are pretty moderate. Therefore, people are attracted to whatever seems like it's in the middle, whether or not it's actually true at all. Perhaps worse, it's an effective device that we often see in the news and social media for someone to label a position or a person moderate and the ones that they don't like extreme or radical. That plays into this desire to feel moderate and accepted, and it pressures people to shift into one camp or another just because they don't want to feel too crazy. Resist the temptation. Never choose a thing simply because it feels moderate. And don't be afraid of someone calling you a radical if the truth is indeed radical. The fallacy of statistical nonsense is really what might be called a bum rush form of argumentation. In it, the person throws out a string of statistical mumbo-jumbo that sounds impressive, but in reality means absolutely nothing. I call this a bum rush argument because what it tries to do is knock its opponents down before anyone has any time to really think about anything. The fact is that people are intimidated by numbers, and when someone comes at them with a lot of statistics, unless they also have a strong knowledge of counterpoints, they will simply often bottle up and not respond. They make the tacit assumption that the numbers the other person are spouting are automatically correct. They therefore give up without a fight. If you doubt me, next time you're in an argument, try just making up some statistics that seem to support your point and throwing them out there. As long as you're not being outlandish and very obvious about it, your opponent will probably accept them as right and true and have no answer. And of course, then please apologize, admit what you did, and explain that this was a rhetorical experience your history professor suggested you have. You can blame me. People use this fallacy intentionally to try to beat you into intellectual submission. One example of this sort of gobbledygook comes from a study of doctors in Russia that Fischer mentions. One criteria that socialists have used to try to show the effectiveness of communism in Russia is to say that the number of doctors in Russia increased from 1,380 in 1897 to 12,000 in 1935. That sounds impressive, right? The Soviets must have brought about a huge increase in the quality of life. But wait, when did the revolution occur? When were the communists actually in charge? The revolution didn't happen until 1917. How many of those doctors came around before that and as a result of efforts from the Tsar? If many of them did, then the Soviets can't really take credit. The problem is that the statistic, as given, doesn't distinguish, and without that, we simply don't know whether it proves its point or not. It's nonsense. The first thing to do for this fallacy is to take a deep breath when numbers start flying and don't let yourself be intimidated. Maybe they do mean what the person using them means, and maybe they don't. You can't evaluate it in the 2 minutes it takes for the person to recite them, and it's unfair of them to demand it if they are. Ask for references to the data. Ask them to show you where they got that from, and promise to look it over and get back to them after proper consideration. If they get mad or won't accept that as an answer, it's another strong proof that they are more interested in manipulating you than they are in getting at the truth. The fallacy of the insidious analogy is a fun one because it's one of the sneakier ones out there. You probably know that nothing is ever proved by an analogy. You can say that this is like that until the cows come home, but it doesn't make it true. Analogies are really only useful as illustrations after you've already established the facts and connections. They can help you understand the facts more deeply, but they don't do any of the establishing on their own. The insidious analogy is when someone sneaks in an analogy into an argument without letting you know. If it gets by your defenses, you'll start thinking of the thing they are analogizing in the terms they want without them ever having to prove it to you. People, including historians, do this all the time without even really thinking about it. You can look at this sample list for some of the more prominent ones. Anytime someone is talking about something else and using these kinds of descriptive words and they don't literally mean it directly, they've snuck an analogy in on you. So, a couple of examples. Take Founding Father. In the American context, that means a very specific set of individuals. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, John Adams, so on and so forth. These are people who shared a specific common culture, common goals, and common ideals. You therefore have immediate and understandable expectations about the kind of person you're talking about when you say Founding Father in the American context. But what if a historian refers to Qin Shi Huang as the Founding Father of China? While technically correct, that historian is drawing an analogy from that person to Washington, Jefferson, Henry, and the rest. If you accept that description, you will begin to have the same feelings and assumptions toward Qin Shi Huang that you do toward the American founders, except for the fact that Qin Shi Huang is a known brutal, mercury-crazed, bloody tyrant. Another one to consider is the word witch hunt, which you see often in history and media. When you hear someone describe, say, the McCarthyite witch hunt, what are you really accepting if you let that come past unchallenged? Well, when did a witch hunt ever actually find a witch in our minds? The term itself implies a brutal and useless pursuit of something that isn't there, something that only exists in our fevered imaginations. So, in that one analogy, if you accept it, you've assumed, likely without ever even considering it, that there never was a serious communistic threat to the U.S. in the 1950s. You've accepted all of that before you've even considered the evidence. So, keep your eye out for comparisons and analogies. Make sure you realize the connections that are being made and that you don't accept them without consideration. The fallacies of mass man and man mass are obviously converses of each other. In man mass, we look at the motivations of the group and we assume that those specific motivations must be shared by every other member. In man mass, we turn that on its head. We find out the motivations of a few members of the group, and then we impute those motivations into everyone in it. It should be quickly apparent why this is a fallacy. Just because a group stands for something, it doesn't follow that all of the members of the group think so specifically. And just because some members of a group think one thing, it doesn't follow that everyone else in the group does. In many cases, this fallacy occurs because of simple laziness. If you can't find sources specifically from the person you're studying, you study the group and then you make assumptions. Or, instead of doing the hard work and studying a large and sufficient sample of the group, you do just enough to get a picture of what you want and stop. It's also a very effective and traditional propaganda tactic that we're seeing pop up again and again these days, especially with man mass. If you want to make a group look bad in the media, you find the craziest of its members and you make it appear that everyone in the group believes like this person does. The goal isn't actually to find out how people think, what they believe, or how they'll behave. It's just to paint certain groups in the light that you want others to see them in. As historians, we must do the hard work of directly connecting motivations and ideas to specific individuals and to make sure that our sample is broad enough to make fair characterizations. As thinkers in general, we should be careful to look at the specific sources and samples that others are offering us. This fallacy might seem rather obvious at first. I would think that most of us would consider racism to be wrong and much more an outright evil. But in the sense that Fischer uses it, it is more popular than ever now with the advent of neo-Marxists and critical theory. In fact, whole schools of recent historiography are now based explicitly on committing the fallacy of racism. So what do we mean by racism? Of course, the obvious answer is discrimination against African Americans and other minorities based on their race. That is very much a real manifestation of it, and it should never be minimized. That said, the concept of racism itself runs much deeper. There are at least 3 different aspects to consider. First, racism is a classification of people into fixed biological groups and the presumption that because a person has been assigned to a particular group, that he or she must behave, believe, and think in a certain way. Second, it is a false classification of learned cultural or ideological behavior into terms of biology, physiology, and heredity. We would think of this as trying to blame a cultural behavior on someone's DNA. Finally, it is a false prejudice for or against a biological or ethnic group. This might surprise some of us in that we are always used to thinking of racism in purely negative terms, meaning that racism is something that someone has against someone else. Fischer makes the point that it also entails favoring someone positively over someone else simply because of their race. In a nutshell, then, racism is making judgments about someone or determining their value based on nothing more than their racial characteristics. This isn't limited to a particular race or ethnic background. For years, American society tried to move away from this toward what Martin Luther King Jr. would have called a colorblind society, where everyone was judged on the basis of their character and their merits. It has experienced a resurgence in newer philosophies that insist that people consider themselves to be racial first and judge other groups based on their own racial characteristics. For example, a white person comes from white privilege merely because they are white and regardless of their circumstances. Race then becomes the key to everything about that person and their culture, and history is to be interpreted on those lines as well if we listen to this school of thought. But we'll deal with that more in our talk on critical theory. Suffice to say here that such views are dominant in historiography today. So, why is this a fallacy? Scientifically speaking, there are no significant differences between the various quote-unquote races in terms of physiology, biology, or genetics. In fact, the races themselves are arbitrary categories originally classified by social Darwinists based on thoroughly discredited pseudosciences like phrenology, which studies the shape of someone's skull. There is nothing in a person's race that determines who they are or how they will act. That means that in terms of doing history, determining motivation and goals, using someone's race to explain their actions is never appropriate or even useful. If race doesn't determine action, what does? Well, usually a person's experience in their culture or subculture. In fact, when a person of one race is raised by another, they thoroughly acculturate to the host culture, and aside from physical characteristics, they shared little to nothing in common with their original race. Where this can be tricky is where cultures happen to correspond with race. People of similar physical characteristics tend to group together and form common cultures. Remember the fallacy of cum hoc propter hoc, with this because of this? People will then notice common physical characteristics are corresponding to the common culture. They're both happening at the same time, and they will assume that one must be the cause of the other. Further, a person can mistakenly believe that their physical characteristics are causing them to act in a certain way, when in fact it's their own cultural experience. When that happens, the abstract idea of race can become a motivation to consider. There may be nothing about your race that makes you act a certain way, but if you have a certain idea about race that you hold to, that you've absorbed from your culture, it can make a difference. If we want to truly end racism and not just shift its permitted targets around, we need to step back and look at the essence of the problem. For historians, that means never presuming your subject's race as an appropriate category for causal or evaluative thought. We should keep our focus on character, environment, and culture. And one last fallacy for your consideration. The Fallacies fallacy. You knew it had to be coming. This is actually a fallacy that we've mentioned in other lectures, if not by name. The fallacy is the idea held in advance and without evidence that there must be a fallacy in every single statement or argument that we encounter. It's the assumption that there is always something to find wrong, we just have to keep looking for it until we dig it up. Remember hearing about cherry-picking evidence? That's exactly what happens here. If you've already made up your mind that something is wrong, you'll keep picking and pecking away at it until you find something, whether it's there or not. Worse, if you can't find the proof you want, you're likely to simply make it up, maybe without even realizing it. The fact is that not every line of reasoning or piece of evidence has something wrong with it. This isn't a me versus them situation where, if you admit that they're right, you lose and they win. Our goal is to find out the truth. If we do, then mission accomplished, whether or not we personally have to admit we were wrong. That means there are several cautions we should keep in mind as we go hunting for fallacious logic. First, as we just mentioned, while we should always be on guard, we shouldn't simply assume in the absence of evidence that someone has to be wrong. Test everything, and if there is something that doesn't sit well with you, dig deeper, but always be ready to admit the accuracy, validity, and justice of someone else's point. Next, remember that just because an argument is fallacious or evidentially wrong in some respects, it doesn't mean that it must be wrong and or useless in all respects. Sometimes someone just makes a mistake, but still ends up coming to at least a partially correct conclusion. Further, as we mentioned in our example of that political hit piece for my dissertation research in another lecture, even if something is a complete lie, it might still help your research. You simply have to recognize the lie for what it is, figure out how it fits into the bigger picture, and you can then use it while explaining that bigger picture. Finally, just because an argument is invalid logically in some or even all respects, it does not prove that the conclusion it comes to is automatically false. If you see a logical fallacy, you can't simply jump up and say, "Aha, you're wrong!" Because, as we've mentioned elsewhere, even a blind hog finds acorns. Invalid logic shows that this line of reasoning doesn't prove the conclusion, but it doesn't mean that the conclusion is wrong. Consider the following example of bad logic. All cars have 4 wheels. A Ford Focus has 4 wheels. Therefore, a Ford Focus is a car. Well, yes, cars have 4 wheels, but so do a lot of other things. Carts, trailers, trucks, etc., etc., etc. And so, this doesn't necessarily prove that a Ford Focus is an actual car. At the same time, a Ford Focus is indeed a car. So you can't simply identify the flaw in the logic and jump to the conclusion that a Ford Focus must therefore be something else. It's one of those red flags. It's a reason to look more closely to try to figure out exactly what's going on. The ability to recognize fallacious thinking is indispensable to an educated person. It alerts us to serious problems in the ideascape around us, making it easier for us to protect ourselves from error and falsehoods. Better, it helps us to comb through our own thinking and writing and weed out bad ideas. Understanding fallacies are an important and powerful tool in your evidential and argumentative arsenal, and I hope you'll take this as just the start of your learning.